Abhishek, thank you for coming all the way out to Milan to this brand new co-working space, which is very reasonably called Spaces. Spaces is an international company that is following in the footsteps of places like WeWork that are creating these beautiful, fully stacked, communal and open co-working spaces. They're really becoming a staple of what is the adaptability of the workplace in a time where the 30-year gold watch model is on its way out, and people are struggling to find any sort of stability economically, professionally. Mostly they're about community and the fact that we really do need to rely on each other in order to survive this next phase of life, which is really being disrupted by automation. And it would be really helpful to have someone who's an actual expert in this field sit down and bring us back to earth with what the technology and science can actually do. What is the truth of what's going on in labor?
A lot of it today, especially where machine learning is being deployed, is in the context of automating tasks that are well codified, that are repeatable, and things that we would consider drudgery is something that's being automated. Now, of course, there's the argument that does that free us up to do more creative or higher order tasks? To a certain degree, yes. But in places where those jobs consist solely of those tasks, now that's a problem, right? So, and we're sitting in this space which is somehow, in a sense, defining what the future of work is going to look like, at least, from a physical and visual perspective, and, the amenities and things that they have here. A lot of it is going to now be task-oriented work. It's going to be things that add value. So it's not going to be just, showing up and punching the clock and doing what's called busy work. It's going to be, how do I add value? And whether that comes from a creative perspective or doing some other higher order task, that remains to be seen.
Is this a place, though, where we get into the bubble of, Western Enlightenment, where we say, oh, well, a meaningful work looks like this, or everyone just needs to tap into their inner creative spirit and create wonderful things? The truth is that what we are considering this creative work or this meaningful work is very much a function of an education, or access to an education, or access to resources in order to create. And I think that that is a very privileged vantage point. It's one that doesn't consider the reality for the majority of the world. So this is a place where I think there's been some very, very deserved pushback. How do we reconcile the reality with what we would like to achieve?
So I think, one of the things that, as you rightly pointed out, is to be sort of culturally and contextually sensitive, right? So values that we hold dear in Western society are, being able to pursue these initiatives, being able to do things that are creative, that tap into, our inner passions. But there are, other cultures that value different sorts of work. And I think at the end of the day, when we're going towards the future of work is what the future and aspirations of that society are. What they project onto that, that's what defines the future of work for them. So I think just the matter of having that cultural sensitivity, that goes a long way.
These are the ethical underpinnings of areas in artificial intelligence research that are only now starting to emerge. And what is really both troublesome and interesting is that there have been a small number of experts in the AI research space who have been ringing the warning bells from the beginning, saying, hey, we need to be paying attention to these things as we're building these technologies, and getting really excited about what the algorithms and the machines can do. But we need to start thinking about safeguards and how this is going to play out, and non-representational data and all of these things. Where are we now in the landscape of AI ethical research?
There's a small set of people who are pushing for this, and an even smaller subset who are pushing for actual technical measures to address some of these issues. So, there's include issues of bias and transparency and accountability, interpretability, and all of these social impacts, right? And one of the things that's lacking today is the sort of interdisciplinary collaboration that's so inherent and necessary for success in this domain. You can't have people who are purely technical opining about social impacts, because, well, if you don't have expertise in that, it's hard for you to say something that's meaningful. And the same thing goes around for social scientists who can't opine about the potential of this technology or where it's going, because they might not understand fully where the technology stands today, machine learning, and what the advances are.
But this is not the sort of thing where you have a small technology that only impacts a very, very tiny segment of the population. AI will be embedded in almost everything we do. Right. The cat's out of the bag. I have no idea where that saying came from, because what was the cat doing in the bag? In seriousness, though, we don't have time to sit around. These interdisciplinary conversations and research initiatives and essentially policy-making initiatives need to be happening right now.
Yeah.
So who needs to be at the table right now in order to make sure that we're building this the right way?
So I think, a part of it is, of course, getting technical experts, people who really understand where the technology is going on board, but also bringing in social scientists who've seen the impacts that new waves of technology can bring on society, be it in terms of inclusion, be it in terms of biases, be it in terms of labor impacts. If you're being, truthful here, the current paradigm of policy making is archaic. We're essentially trying to legislate horses while cars are coming on road. And we don't exaggerate when we say that. That's the pace of progress in machine learning. So what we need is a framework that's iterative, that's agile, that allows policymakers to quickly grasp what the progress is, what the new impacts are going to be, and then change mechanisms so that we can capture that, bring it into policy as quickly as possible. Something that comes to mind is the work of Michael Carlin out of the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada. The work that he did was he put out a public document on Google Docs, and the goal there was, how do we get fast feedback and input into generating and producing a policy document. And what he was trying to do with that document was to figure out how governments can use AI in a responsible manner within their services. So when the Canadian government offers services that use a machine learning or an AI component towards its citizens, what are some responsible ethical practices that they should adhere to?
You have also started an ethics initiative.
I founded the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, and the vision for the institute was, as we've been discussing so far, is to move from talk to action. So how do we run applied experiments? What are the concrete steps, the technical tools, the frameworks? What is it that we can build that actually pushes forward research in this field? Because that's what's missing. I mean, in the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a lot of talk around this, but there's been very little actual research that builds tools and frameworks that an organization that's deploying AI within customer service or within deciding whether to grant loans or not, what is it that they can do? And this is the goal of the institute, is to fund and encourage applied experiments that produce tools and frameworks and techniques, both at a technical but also at a policy level. I think one of the things that I fear that might happen with this space is that desensitization that happened with the climate change debate, where we had so much talk about it, and everybody at some point got desensitized enough that when you mention climate change, you just sort of roll your eyes and it goes in one ear and comes out the other. We don't want that to happen with something that's this pervasive and this important.
Well, and that is just so human nature, isn't it? It almost takes a calamity in order to get people to move on something that has been shouting at them for years. You just really hope that you can avoid or at least mitigate harm by being proactive instead of waiting for the world to, fall in on itself. Yeah. This is something that is in our control. This is not a natural entity. What do you think Canada can uniquely contribute to the space of creating ethical frameworks?
So, I mean, we have the spotlight of the world on us right now as, being the AI hub of the world. And, that comes from the fact that we have tremendous legacy in terms of technical research as the founding fathers of deep learning and such. What we can contribute uniquely as Canada is our focus on diversity, inclusion, equity, and having a fair and just society. That's what Canada is known for. Now it's just a matter of translating those strong Canadian values, pairing that with this magnificent technical research that we have, put that together, and then build these frameworks. So that's really, I think, Canada's unique contribution. I mean, name a few other countries that can do that. We can put them on one hand probably, and I think Canada is definitely a beacon there.
And thus the urgency for Canada to really get moving in driving the research in ethics. Yeah. You mentioned inclusion. Yeah. I think it would really help to try to get a sense of how social inclusion intersects with AI, and what from your research can you pull from that intersection?
One of the things that social inclusion has its scope and definition in the social sciences, and that's fairly well understood. When we start to bring that into the AI space, there are two elements that I think start to expand the definition, or maybe add more nuance to the definition of social inclusion, and it's automation and sort of global reach. So automation, because we're taking the human out of the loop. We're making decisions and allocating resources that affect people's lives without having a defined entity where we can direct accountability.
That sort of is the crux of the problem, isn't it? Is that social inclusion is such a broad and contextually dependent concept. And I think this is where we're starting to see many of the discriminatory and bias-based machine learning problems occur. Right. Do you think that bias is actually the number one problem we face in this space? And if not, what else is going on?
So I think it's one of the biggest problems that we face in machine learning applications. And bias, if you're looking at just pure computer science, is a neutral term, right? I mean, if you look at the mathematical equation for a neuron, it's just you're multiplying the kernel with the input vector plus the bias term. It doesn't have any values in it. So bias then is from a societal perspective, from a social science perspective, that we have values associated with it. So there are places where bias is okay, right? So let's say you're looking at cardiac disease problem, and you see that the incidence rates in men versus women are different. So having a bias there is probably important, because you might end up underdiagnosing men who tend to have a higher incidence of cardiac disease if you don't have bias in there. So again, then when is bias problematic? It's when you have a subsection of the population, be it by age, be it by ethnic origin, or anything else, where they face an unfair outcome. That's when bias is a problem, and this is increasingly becoming something that we need to pay attention to. I mean, we have live machine learning systems out there in the wild today that have biases, right? And the canonical example for this is the COMPASS program in the United States with the criminal risk score, where it was inherently biased against African Americans. And these are real people whose real lives have been impacted because of this system. Our goal then should be, well, how do we control for bias in these situations? What can we do to prevent and mitigate bias in systems that have already been deployed? The research from Joy Bulambani out of the MIT Media Lab, so her project called Gender Shades, what she looked at was a very high misclassification rate for black women when she used commercial facial recognition APIs. When you abstract away machine learning applications behind an API, third-party developers have very little control to do anything to fix it. When you're using a commercial API, you're just propagating and amplifying the impact of those biases. The other thing being that, which I really liked from her project, was that she actually made an effort to build an inclusive facial recognition dataset, and she has made it open source for other people. The companies that she had investigated in her research, they actually corrected those biases in their systems and have now published revised versions of their systems, and that tells you that people can make an impact. And it's a matter of acknowledging that these biases exist and then making an effort to actually correct it.
So one of the major ethical issues that came up in this research are recognition rates. What's a reasonable rate of recognition?
So I think when we're looking at the minorities, be they by age, be they by ethnicity, the recognition rate should be at par with what you're offering to whatever the majority there is. And that's what gets hidden when you have single performance metrics. So that's a way for us to, I guess, sweep under the rug the lower performance measures on minorities, the higher error rates on minorities, because by definition a minority has fewer sample points. So we're willing to tolerate a higher error rate, because when pooled together, it shows up as something that's trivial. And that's something that we need to start moving away from. So yes, it's great to train your machine learning system on a single performance metric because it gives you a direction and steps on how to improve your system. But when you're actually deploying it out in the world, you're not deploying it on homogeneous entities. You're deploying it on real people who have their own identities.
That's what we seem to forget. These are human beings whose lives are altered or impacted by these very solutions.
Exactly, and they're not just a series of attributes that you're trying to optimize for. At a machine learning level, yes, but at an application level, at a product or service level, these are real people. And so you need to make sure that everybody has a sort of equitable experience with your product or service, and nobody feels that they feel left out, because that is what discrimination is all about.
Well, and that's the thing, it seems to be falling to the people who are directly impacted by these biases and low recognition rates, who are also being tasked with doing the heavy lifting in exposing them, and then getting the companies to change their software, and how can we just do better than that?
One of the things that we can do to act as a sort of stopgap measure there is to publish, let's say, a fair disclosure that tells people that we know that we don't have the same level of performance as we do for this majority, so take our system with that grain of salt. And then when we're thinking about using these systems in let's say medicine or in law, it's that term math washing, right? Which is people trust numerical systems more because they feel that they're objective, but at the end of the day, those numerical systems have been built by ingesting data that captures all of our societal and historical biases. So bringing it back, I think having not only that fair disclosure, but also a person who's well informed, not just sensitive to the technical underpinnings of the system and the impacts that it can have on the target population, but also someone who's aware of the limitations of that particular instance of the system that might be biased towards one subsection because they haven't had enough training data, as an example. We can't place the burden of discrimination or to fix the problem of discrimination on the people who are affected by it. And the reason being because they might often be in situations where they don't have enough resources or technical know-how to even know that they're being discriminated against and then to do something about it. Machine learning models are not trivial to run, but there is some budget that needs to be allocated towards that. Access to data, I think, is another big one. If you're working with toy data sets which are already well trimmed and normalized and like data sets that you would find on Kaggle, the machine learning competition, like you're not going to do social science research that addresses bias based on those. You need to go out there and collect real samples from the world where people are interacting with these systems, because that's another part of machine learning where the real world data distribution often ends up being quite different from the things that you've trained and tested on, and then to be able to reconcile those things, again, that requires resources. So that's sort of the the goal, where if we can build institutions where we can bring these researchers together, and that's
the most obvious place to start housing these is in every major university that's doing seminal research in machine learning. They should each have their own AI ethics centers. They already have access to leading academics in multiple disciplines who can find this space, shared space together. Why isn't this happening already?
One of the things that I sometimes get a feeling of is that this domain of the ethical development of AI is not perceived as being technical enough. It's not perceived as something that you can publish at a conference. So maybe there are those elements as well that we can tweak. And the argument of it being not technical enough, it shocks me, because the work that Joy did is highly quantitative, is highly technical. Same with the work from Timnit, the data sheets work that she has published earlier this year. Again, highly technical and highly relevant. I think what we need to do is to, as a collective, accept that this research is meaningful, and then allow for these, postdocs, these professors to be able to publish that kind of work, even from corporate AI labs, where if they publish some of this work and we can highlight that at conferences or share that in wider media, then that gives more incentive for people to do that kind of work, because at some point these researchers need to earn their spurs, be it tenure, be it more grants or more budgets. They have to justify why they're doing that work, and if there are few individuals who can be driven by their values and morals, and the rest sort of stick to what moves them forward.
That goes back to the fact that this is very much a human-driven series of technologies. We have control over how they're implemented, how they're safeguarded. And right now it looks like the way to protect ourselves while this sort of nebulous field is building itself is to make some trade-offs. What do you think are some reasonable trade-offs right now, understanding that we can't realistically impede progress?
So, I think when we're thinking of these trade-offs, we need to be careful about the mission critical applications, as I said. So something like warfare doesn't have an acceptable trade-off. You never can justify a casualty that happened because of an erroneous decision from a machine learning system, because we didn't want to have a human in the loop. So that maybe is a domain where it's not justifiable. But if we look at something like self-driving cars, deploying them in controlled environments where the risk is very low of triggering pedestrian accidents, and then training those systems up to a degree where we can have limited trials, there is of course tremendous benefit to having an AV grid where accidents would go down tremendously, because there would be little unpredicted behavior. So the trade-off there, I think, is mostly from a utilitarian standpoint, where how much are we willing to sacrifice in the short run so that we can get to this quote unquote more utopian society later on. And I think those trade-off decisions shouldn't be made by a few people when it has the potential to impact a whole population.
Thank you for the work you're doing in this space, and to everyone who's doing work in this space. Thanks for coming here to talk about it. I think we need to amplify your voice and the voice of people who are really pushing research in this area as loud as we can. Let's hope that this is the first of many, many, many more initiatives to drive this segment of our future.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.